Okay, hi, welcome back. I'm going to continue on with the introduction, but I'm going to do it as I move through the text. But one of the things I want to point out that I'm missing the page here. This is what my book looks like. This is what your book should probably look like. Is that the beginning he has a scripture that says, "The letter killeth, but the spirit lives." And that is going to come back full circle. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about the text. It was something by Paul, and what he meant by it was that the legal, the law, the legalism of Christianity kills, the letter killeth. But the spirit, which the New Testament emphasizes, the spirit lives. Okay, so there's that. Another thing I wanted to just bring up is great expectations. The reason why I try to connect text is because when you get to the Q2 question and you're looking at a text that you've never seen before and it's a cold read, if you can see the Victorian characteristics of it, or if you can, you look and you see that this is an American part excerpt from American novel, then you're more likely to pick up on the themes, because that's what you start to do when you study literature. Is you start to be able to kind of use what you've learned in this book to the next one and the next one, and so in order to prepare for the Q2, hopefully you've seen enough different genres of literature to be able to pick up, like for instance when I say Industrial Revolution, something that seems very nostalgic of progress, and by knowing that and knowing what you've read before, I think you're more likely to come up with a better claim. So another Victorian novel, Great Expectations. And I've taught this before, but I did kind of a small video on it. One of the things I wanted to point out, yesterday I said that one of the main texts people were reading is Origins of Species. And in the very beginning of Great Expectations, Pip is at a graveyard and he's looking at the graves of his parents and 5 little brothers that he says here, and this is really important because it's an allusion to Darwinism. And he says, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle. So that's Darwin's expression, the universal struggle, the survival of the fittest. And this brings me to another theme in literature, and that's naturalism. Naturalism, in short, is about man existing kind of without God and this other, realm. Really, he's stuck in his environment, sort of like nature, like animals. And you see in naturalistic text a lot of comparison with the struggle that animals have. For instance, I was always treated as if I insisted on being born in opposition to the dictates of reason, religion, and morality, and against the dissuading arguments of my best friends. Another example with Jude here is when he is talking about the ant, and actually I'm confusing this. The ant is talking about him, Jude, about how his parents died and how it would have been a mercy to us all if you would have died too. So, I'll just read this part. Well, you may ask of Mr. Williams, he's my great-nephew since you come last way. The old inhabitant who answered was tall, gaunt woman who spoke tragically on the most trivial subject. That sounds like a Dickens thing to say too. And gave the phrase, her conversation, to such auditor in turn. He came to Mellstock down to South Wessex about a year ago, Worse luck for Brenda, turning to the right, where his father was living, and took with the shakings for the death, and died in 2 days, you know, Caroline, turning to the left. It would have been a blessing if God Almighty had taken thee too, with thy mother and thy father. Poor useless boy. And so he runs off. He has this job. He's got to scare the birds. And as he's feeding the birds, he kind of makes this connection that they seem like himself to be living in a world which did not want them. Why should he frighten them away? They took upon them more and more the aspect of gentle friends and parishioners, the only friends he could claim as being in the last degree interested in him, for his aunt had often told him that she was not. So he gives them food, and he gets punished. He gets beaten. Back then you could just beat children at random if you wanted to. And of course he feels very dejected, and he reflects on this later as he's looking at kind of just the overall nature of things. That after he leaps out of his arms, he says, and it wasn't from pain that hurt, through that was keen enough, not from the perception of the flaw in the terrestrial scheme by which what was good for God's birds was bad for God's gardener, which left the awful sense that he had wholly disgraced himself before he had been a year in the parish, and hence might be a burden to his great aunt for life. Also, if you think about his situation in social class and naturalism, and like I said before, this isn't American novel where you have at least the idea of the American dream. Where you were born, whoever was your father and mother, pretty much determines your destiny. And so you can see that would be more of a naturalistic characteristic, because you can't help. You didn't ask to be born. I used to make this argument all the time with my parents, and you probably have too, but you can just say, well, it wasn't my idea to have me. You did that. But anyways, so as he is also looking, as this is also a coming of age. So as he's trying to understand the world around him, he also has a very, at this point, idealistic view of religion and education. And he is optimistic at this point. And it seems like he almost gets punished for being so optimistic. Hardy's going to make him pay for this. So in the very beginning of the book, he is kind of romanticizing his teacher, Phillotson, who will also come back in the novel a little bit later. And it's very telling what Phillotson says about school and during this time, about the university. Because he asks, well, what are you going to Christminster for? And he says, well, don't speak of this everywhere. You know what a university is and a university degree? It's the necessary hallmark of a man who wants to do anything in teaching. My scheme, or dream, is to be a university graduate and then be ordained. So you see the religious aspect of that tied into his scheme that's necessary. And so he goes to Christminster. He plans to live there or near it, shall be in the headquarters, so to speak, if my scheme is practical. So he has the qualifications. The trick is will he be accepted based on things that are completely out of his control? And then Jude is going to have the same problem, but it's going to be worse for Jude, because Jude comes from a poor background. And he tells them as he leaves, he says to always remember to be kind to animals. And I do think that was Hardy too, Hardy had a lot of respect for nature. He spent a lot of time walking, studying the trees, and very meditative guy. And so the inn, though, if you remember, this is very easily looked past because it's kind of confusing. But remember what I said last time about church restoration. This is a very telling passage, but also just to try to get this idea of what is Hardy's tone in all of this. How is he participating kind of in this story? And he says, in the place of the tall new building of modern Gothic design, unfamiliar to English eyes, had been erected on the new piece of ground by certain obliterator of historic records, who had run down from London and back in a day, the site whereon so long had stood the ancient temple to the Christian divinities was not even recorded on the green and level grass plot that had immemorially been the churchyard, and the obliterated graves being commemorated by 18 penny cast iron crosses warranted to last 5 years. So you can probably sense that there's this satirical way of talking about the reverence of the historical church. Okay, and so you have that in mind. Hardy's horror of looking back at churches that were so-called restored back to look like its original architectural designs, and it didn't. It was Gothic. Okay, so that becomes important later on. The naturalism of where he is in society is going to be important, but also the letter killeth is going to be important. And later on, what you'll see is when Jude finds that he has a weakness for women, as you know most do, natural instincts, he compares them with animal instincts. And so this becomes a conflict between the flesh, which you will see with Arabella, and the spirit, which you'll see with Sue. So it's a very interesting contrast. And speaking of contrast, I want to read this important quote that Hardy wrote. And if you wrote an essay about this, this might be something you would want to add in your introduction. So this would be something you should probably, at least generally, try to memorize. And he says, of course, in the letter that he wrote to someone, the book is all contrast, or it was meant to be in its original conception. Alas, what a miserable accomplishment it is when I compare it with what I meant to make it. Sue and her heathen gods set against Jude reading the Greek Testament, Christminster academical, Christ in the slums, Jude the saint, Jude the sinner, Sue the pagan, Sue the saint, marriage, no marriage, etc., etc. And most books that you find will have a great deal of contrast, and that may be a starting point for you as you analyze characters. That's why you have character foils or contrast, right? So this passage, I'm going to probably end here, and then I'll do another video maybe in the next couple of days. But listen to this as in terms of coming of age. And also remember that Hardy gets accused of being very pessimistic. Okay, so growing up brought responsibilities, he found. Events did not rhyme quite as he had thought. Nature's logic was too horrid for him to care for. That mercy towards one set of creatures was a cruelty towards another sickened his sense of harmony. As you got older and you felt yourself to be the center of your time and not at a point in its circumference, as you had felt when you were little, You were seized with a sort of shuddering, he proceeded. All around you there seemed to be something glaring, garish, rattling, and the noises and glares hit upon the little cell called your life and shook it and warped it. So you can see at the end of, I think it's Mayor of Casterbridge, one of the protagonists looks out at this, what he calls, a sorry world, a sorry life. So, rightly so, he has that reputation. But I'm going to suggest that Hardy is more facetious than he is pessimistic. I think that he is, I don't know, just kind of having some fun with this, because he knows how it's going to rattle the public. And then, of course, he gets very upset when it is taken as badly as I think he meant to provoke. I think he is trying to provoke people. Because, in a way, he can keep himself at a distance from what's actually happening. There's a quote I like to use that's, life is a tragedy. Life is a comedy for those who think, and a tragedy for those who feel. And if you are in this and it threatens you, you're going to get more offended. If you're secure in your faith or whatever, you can handle the arguments. It's okay. It's not going to change what you believe, really. But for people of that time, it really did upset some people. So next time I'll talk about Christminster and how he compares it to a heavenly Jerusalem. But he has not been there. He's only looking at it as kind of like the Americans did when they came and said that America should be a city on the hill. It's not a reality, it's an ideal. And that is what he's also going to criticize about Christianity. And if you can't remember whole quotes, that's fine. But there's certain things that you can say in the text that would help your essay. And one of those terms would be nature's logic. Not man's, but nature's logic. And we're at the mercy of nature's logic. Okay? All right, see you next time. Thanks, bye.